Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We'll get started in just about 1 minute. We'll give it one more minute and then we will get started with our presentation today. Thank you for being here and thanks for taking time out of your schedule to join us.
When you're driven to get the job done right, the days are long and the miles are many. You can't accept good enough, and you don't believe in limits. To make something truly better than before, to make it last, you never settle and demand a higher level of precision. Day in and day out, we're on that path, advancing filtration science, developing superior filtration technologies to keep you going, to ensure your performance now and in the future, to protect, to go further, to keep you going. Run cleaner, longer, with the certainty of filtration science.
All right, welcome in everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join our session today. We do try to do these sessions monthly. If this is the first time you're joining us, you can go back and watch some of the previous sessions that we've got recorded out on fleetguard.com. You just simply go to fleetguard.com, and from that homepage, you'll see a few menu options at the top. Click on support. You'll see product training, and we've got a calendar where we're going to be updating these type of sessions throughout the course of the rest of the year. But you can go back, like I said, and watch the replay of the previous topics we've covered so far in 2024. And if you have some suggestions, there will be a survey link that's going to go out after today's presentation. Would love to get your feedback on the session today, but also, if there's topics that you're interested in that we maybe haven't covered so far, please give us that feedback. And then that way we can take that into consideration and try to cover those in future sessions. As you can see from our topic listed here today, and hopefully what you signed up for, we're going to be talking a little bit about air filtration today, covering some solutions and best practices when it comes to air filter maintenance. And hopefully, we're going to cover some good topics kind of under that umbrella. And certainly, if you have questions, I've already seen one question come in the Q&A window so far. Please, this is your time. If you have questions to ask, drop those in that Q&A window, or feel free to drop in the chat window. I'll do my best to answer those as we go along. And certainly, as we get to the end, we'll have some time for questions and answers as well. If I don't have an answer, I can definitely reach out to people within our organization that would have an answer, and I can get that back to you as quick as possible. So would very much encourage the questions as we go along today. That certainly helps me feel like we're hitting the mark if we're able to answer some questions that maybe you guys have, or maybe some things that you've seen out in the field before. So please take advantage of that opportunity. For those that have not met me before or have not joined one of our sessions, my name is Jay Stevenson. I am the North America training leader for the Fleetguard business as a part of Atmos Filtration Technologies. I've been with our company now and our brand just a little over 11 years, and I'm based here in the Nashville, Tennessee area. So a few of the things we're going to cover today, we're going to talk a little bit about airborne contamination and why it's so important to protect against that, and how that can be really a negative towards the performance and life of a combustion engine. We're going to talk a little bit about air filtration and how an air filter actually works. How air filters behave, how they function, how they as they kind of load over the course of their life, how that actually operates, and then really answering the burning question, well, how do you know when to change your air filter? When's the right time to do that? And so we're going to cover that in great detail. And then at the end, definitely covering some best practices, maybe some solutions that can help with understanding that question of when should I be changing my air filter, but definitely some best practices in terms of maintenance, things that very commonly are done out in the field, our recommendations about how you should think about those things, review those things, handle those types of maintenance situations. So, please, like I said, if you got questions we're going through, feel free to drop those in the chat window there. So, as you think about a combustion engine, whether it's diesel engine or gasoline, some other form of combustion, really, the air filter is a super critical part of keeping that engine happy and healthy over its intended life cycle. So, an air filter, unlike some of the other closed loop filtration systems on some of those applications, you really have one chance to clean up any of that dirty or dusty air, any of those airborne contaminants and particles before that air actually enters the engine for combustion. So it's super critical that you have an air filter that's up to the job, up to the task. It's going to provide the right level of performance and efficiency in keeping those airborne particles and dust contaminants out of the engine. So when you talk about these airborne contaminants, what are we really talking about here? Well, we're going to see that in just a second. But as you think about, again, why it's so important, I've never really seen it published from an engine OEM, Cummins or otherwise, of exactly how much dust it takes to destroy an engine, but it does not take very much. I'm sure there's some liability there in terms of not really wanting to give an exact figure, but it does not take much dust to get into that engine system and cause damage. Much of these particles, as we're going to see, are very abrasive. And, that is going to have a very negative effect on the life of those internal engine components. And so we really have to be careful at protecting against these very fine particles, which often are, very fine, very small, but abrasive. And so you can see some symptoms of engine damage that can be caused by that dust ingression, or basically the engine, breathing in and eating that those airborne particles. So everything from hard engine starts to essentially just poor performance of the engine, oil consumption, engine rod knocking, connecting rod failure, bearing failure. These are all things that are attributed again to those abrasive particles, creating additional wear, premature wear into those components, and causing them to not work properly. Smoke from the exhaust, which again can be a result of some of those things above, damage to the seal or bearing on the turbocharger, and even excessive crankcase blow-by gases. So, basically we're talking about a not healthy engine, right? So we want to prevent this stuff. And one of the best ways you can do that is by using an air filter that's designed to keep that system working properly. So when we go back to these airborne contaminants and you realize kind of, well, how can dust really be causing these types of problems? Well, when you think about what that dust actually is, a lot of what's kind of floating out there, you think about a dirty, dusty construction site, or you're driving down the road and there's kind of dust blowing around in the air, dirt kind of blowing around in the air. A lot of what that is floating around in the air is actually silica dust. And silica is, essentially quartz when we talk about quartz. And if you look at this scientific scale on the right side of the screen, this is the Mohs hardness scale. And basically, in a short sense, this is a way for somebody to measure the hardness of a material. And so basically, you're taking one material and kind of scraping it or scratching against another material to see essentially which one's harder. And so in this kind of simple 1 to 10, with 1 being talc and 10 being diamond, or kind of the hardest type of material out there from these kind of organics, you'll see quartz is about a 7. Quartz is actually more abrasive or stronger, tougher than some grades of steel used out in the real world. So when you think about that silica dust, that quartz dust kind of floating around in the air, yeah, certainly even in small doses, as an engine might ingest that or ingress that up into the combustion area within the engine, that's going to cause problems. That's going to cause premature wear, and that's why it's such a problem for a combustion engine. You've got to prevent these things from getting inside those critical engine components. So that's why air filtration is such an important part of the system. So we're going to cover just a few basics of an air intake system, right? There's lots and lots and lots of different kinds of air intake systems out there, basically for any different type of application, everything from your your lawnmower all the way up to a piece of a high horsepower equipment. Those air intake systems are going to look a little different, but in general, the principle's similar here. You've got an air inlet where that dirty, unfiltered air is going to kind of be drawn into the system, and it'll be ducted over at some point to the air filter housing. And this is where your air filter element actually is going to live or reside. And so as that air passes through that air filter element, which we'll see in a second, then it's going to go on through some other channel to either the cylinder directly for combustion, or it could go on to the turbocharger in an application that's using force induction. So that kind of clean air path could look a little different depending on what the application is, but either way, it's being routed and plumbed through the air filter and then onto the engine to be actually used and consumed in that combustion process. So if we look at a typical cylindrical air filter design, this is a Fleetguard Opti-Air system that some of you guys may be familiar with, but this is pretty typical of a cylindrical air filter design. And we have that air filter or air cleaner housing. Sometimes people might call it the air box or air intake system, but it is that air filter housing. This is where those air filters are going to live. And we see our air inlet. So this is where that dirty, dusty air is going to come in through, and it's going to go from that outside of that air filter element through the air filter and onto the clean side. And then from there, it's going to come out of that air outlet. So then that's where that clean air that we've just filtered is now going to go on to be used and consumed by the engine. Just one other thing I wanted to point out, on many of these applications, especially for, heavy duty applications or off highway equipment applications, typically they're going to be those air filter housings or air cleaner housings are going to be outfitted with a dust ejection valve or a DEV valve, right? Dust ejection valve. And this is basically a duckbill valve that as those heavier particles of contamination, airborne debris, dust, that type of stuff, as it settles within the air cleaner, you can actually use this to kind of purge some of those airborne contaminants out of that air cleaner system without having to necessarily open the whole thing up and do a clean. So you may notice that on some applications as well. Now, for many applications in the off-highway space, so when you think about stuff that's driving around in very dirty, dusty environments, or maybe driving around out in the field in an ag setting, a lot of these systems are also going to be outfitted with a pre-cleaner. And just like the name would suggest, this is basically a piece of equipment that's going to help pre-clean the air before it even goes into the air filter. And really what these are designed to do is, like the text in the bottom left says, really preventing those larger or heavier contaminants from prematurely clogging the air filter. So as you can kind of see from that diagram on the right, basically it's got some fins, kind of some blades on the inside that are rotating. And so, you can imagine if you were out driving a combine or a tractor out in a very dusty cornfield or something like that, you got a lot of, kind of chaff and stuff kind of blowing around in the air. These pre-cleaners can help really knock a lot of that debris kind of out of the system before it even goes in and could, cause a lot of premature plugging issues on an air filter. So we do have some materials out on the website, on our fleetguard.com website, if you're interested in looking up any of those pre-cleaners, just to see what options may fit your application in the event maybe you're operating in a high dust environment and you don't have a pre-cleaner. This could be a good solution for you to help extend that air filter life. So one other thing I wanted to talk about, as you think about environment, when you think about the life of an air filter, environment really has a great effect on the life of your air filter. And I know that seems pretty obvious, but you want to take that into consideration when you think about how you may be speccing a piece of equipment or how you may be maintaining a piece of equipment. And, our example here on the screen, we've got, just an over-the-road bus application on the left, kind of a charter looking bus. And you've got a piece of mining equipment or construction equipment operating over in the dirt, a lot of dust, high extreme dust environment there. And I point this out because we've actually had instances of this over the years where we've had customers call in and they're having dusting issues with their application. We start asking some questions, trying to figure out a little bit more about their situation. And there's a particular one that I usually bring up as an example because I thought it was such a good one. We had a customer in Western Canada, and they were operating sort of a small fleet of these buses, like you see on the left, and they were dusting engines. They were going through, I guess, dirtier environments than what those buses were really spec to handle. And as we'll see in a second, they were really just using a single stage air filter solution on that bus application. We started asking some questions, and actually, the customer was using those buses to transport personnel onto a mine site. And so they were driving these buses that were really intended, from the OEM to be used in an over the road setting, driving down paved, asphalt pathways, roadways, and single stage air filtration. And they were driving them down these dirty, dusty dirt roads, miles and miles and miles every day, just transporting workers back and forth, back and forth. And so it was actually causing some issues for them and their operation, and they were having engine problems. So that's one where, again, the OEM, they've got kind of a tough job there because they're designing that system and specing that system to be used in a certain way, thinking most people are going to be using these over the road. And in reality, the customer was using it in a way that was kind of very different than probably how it was supposed to have been being used, right? So we were able to work with them and come up with a solution where we were able to actually change the air intake setup for them so that they had a single, a primary and a secondary air filter element, giving them better protection and really giving them some kind of best practices to be using for their business going forward so they wouldn't have that issue anymore. So I know this seems really basic, really fundamental, but it is something important to remind your customers, if you're somebody that's selling and helping them maintain their equipment, just be aware of the environment that you're in. That's going to have a very direct impact on the life of the air filters that they have on that particular engine application. So I've mentioned here, I kind of let the cat out of the bag, but we've got the primary and secondary air filter element. So these are kind of your two types of air filter elements that you would typically see in an engine application or on a particular vehicle or equipment application. And so, most of those, if it's a single stage air filter, it's going to be using that primary air filter element. And this is really your first line of defense against any of that airborne contamination. So dust, debris, all the stuff we've talked about previously. And in the event that that is your sole air filter, that is, it's your one line of defense in protecting against those airborne contaminants. In the event you have a system where you have a primary and a secondary air filter element, again, thinking about how this is going to work, you typically are going to be changing or servicing that primary element more often than the secondary element. Because it is sort of taking the brunt of all airborne contamination. That's the one that's going to be getting serviced more frequently. So in those situations where you may have a primary and secondary air filter element, let's say this is a piece of off-highway equipment, maybe it's something on a mine site or construction site or agriculture site, where it is experiencing a dirtier than normal air situation with contamination. This is one where that secondary air filter element is actually serving as kind of a backup, sort of a safety in some ways. Some people actually even call these safety elements. So it's giving a little bit of extra protection behind that primary air filter element in the event that, that primary is for some reason maybe bypassing a little bit of dust. That secondary is going to give some extra security there behind the primary. And as a result, it's typically not seeing the full brunt of all of that airborne contamination. So you typically may be servicing those secondaries less often. You'll notice that third bullet also, that it also serves as a little bit of extra protection during service events. And we're going to cover that towards the end of our session today. But as you service your air filter element and you remove that air housing or that cover on the air box, and we remove that primary air filter element out of the system, oftentimes that secondary may still be back in the system, and that's going to prevent any sort of dust from that may have gotten between the primary and the secondary from actually getting onto the clean side of the air intake system during that service event. So it provides a little bit of extra protection there as well. But certainly, a point to take home, if you have a piece of equipment that's operating in a very dirty, dusty environment, it is recommended that you are running a primary and secondary air filter element. And typically those air intake systems are going to be designed to have both of those, running in sequence. Sometimes those will actually fit within each other. I think the part numbers we're looking at here on the screen, that's one where you've got a primary on the left, and those secondaries may actually fit inside as kind of a structural component even of the primary. So it just depends on your application, but that's sort of the reason why you have a primary and secondary for those high dust environments. Now, when you think about media, which media is a big part of what makes a filter do its job, this is really kind of at the heart of the matter. There are typically what we see with air filters today, especially from what we design and what's really common in the marketplace, air filters are generally using cellulose media. And cellulose is essentially paper. It's paper media. And it makes sense because, even as engines have gotten more complicated, more complex, really even finer and more sensitive systems as a part of that engine system over time, more recent years. Really, at the end of the day, we're still chasing the same dirty, dusty air that we've kind of always been chasing, right? Those types of contaminants haven't really changed. Dirt that's flying around in the air on a construction site is the same as it was 20 years ago, same as it was 40 years ago. So cellulose media, by and large, has not changed dramatically. That's still a lot of what is being used out in the marketplace today. You'll notice this picture here on the left. This is a scanning electron microscope photo of cellulose or paper media at about 250 times magnification. Now, one of the advances that has come along in air filtration media over more recent years is the introduction of nanofiber. And for you guys that are on the call here that are familiar with NanoNet, that's kind of our proprietary media that we have as a part of Fleetguard. We do have some nanofiber application in some of our air filters, and I'm going to show some part numbers on the screen in a second. But really, these are intended primarily to be used in those high extreme dust environments where you get very fine dust particles in the air. So if you think about certain mining applications where there's very, very fine dust in that air, you can think about a coal mine or something like that, very fine dust in the air. This is where nanofiber can really provide some additional benefit and actually extend the life of that air filter during its service life. So you'll notice the photo on the left, we said that's at about 250 times magnification. The photo on the right is at about 1,000 times magnification. So you can see those very, very, very fine nanofibers that are actually laid over that layer of cellulose or paper media. So it's kind of giving a coating of nanofiber over that more traditional or legacy cellulose media rather. So another photo there, and this one's at about 500 times magnification, but you can see that 10 micron particles sort of getting caught in that web of nanofiber. So that's your real benefit in using nano. Here's some just example part numbers on the screen, just to give you an idea as you look at those typical applications on the right. These are going to be a lot of your off-highway machines, particularly high horsepower, particularly mining focused, with some of those brands listed on the screen. But you can kind of spill over into a little bit more of the construction market as well. And, if you've got applications where you think there could be some benefit of having a nanofiber filter to extend that service life, it's common for us to have taken these nanofiber part numbers, and we've actually been able to, in many instances with customers, take a typical 500-hour service interval and extend that out to 1,000 or 1,500 hours, 2,000 hours. So there's a lot of benefit for our customers that have been using our nanofiber air filters. So let's get right in the heart of this. I think this is some of the best material to cover, and just, good reinforcement of the basics of the foundational principles here, but not necessarily something that everybody knows. So how does an air filter actually work? It's kind of contrary to how you might think an air filter would work. I'm going to kind of spoil it here for you guys, many of you guys. But when you think about a liquid filter, so think about a fuel filter or a lube filter. Typically with those liquid filters, they tend to have a little bit of a drop off in performance as they age. So as they get closer to the end of their service life, they're maybe not as efficient as they were at the very start of their life. They tend to kind of lose that performance, where air filters are kind of the opposite. Air filters are actually designed in a way, the way they function is using cake filtration. And so as they load dust particles at the time it's brand new, that brand new air filter that's just been put in service, they actually tend to increase efficiency as they go through the course of their life, kind of right up until they don't. Then they get, a little bit too restricted. They start hitting that level of terminal restriction, and that's when we want to start replacing the filter. But basically how it works is as those dust particles load onto the media, they tend to kind of create a cake layer that will actually allow those particles to continue to load, but the air molecules or oxygen molecules can still kind of find their way in between those dust or dirt particles, airborne particles that have loaded on the outside of the filter. And so it does create kind of that filtering effect where the efficiency will actually tend to increase over the life of the air filter. And as a result of that, if we're kind of asking the question, how do I know when to change the air filter? Well, I know just from conversation and talking to people, out in the field, going and visiting customers, customer sites, and talking with end users, oftentimes people open the air box, they open that air cleaner housing open, and they pull the air filter out and they look at it and they're saying, oh man, this filter is really dirty. It's time to replace it. That's actually a terrible way to decide when to change your air filter because, as we just discussed, air filters actually become more efficient as they go through the course of their life. And so, an air filter that looks really dirty, really dusty, like the one we're seeing here on the screen, in reality, it may have a lot of life left. It may have half of its life left, even though it looks really dirty and really dusty, and it's performing well. So that's something to take home. Something to write down here as you think about a best practice. Visual inspection of an air filter is not really a valid way to decide when to change that air filter. So if we're knocking that off our list, let's go to the next question. So, another common way that people decide when to change their air filters is by changing it at a set amount of time. So, hey, every 6 months we change our air filters. That's just what we do. We go by the book, and that's what it says to do. Well, why is that a problem? Well, kind of like we just said, right? In that really about those first few percentage points of a new air filter's life, that's actually the time at which an air filter is least efficient. So, kind of what we're saying here is the majority of dust particles that are going to get through an air filter is when that air filter is brand new. And so, you guys may have heard of a term before called initial efficiency. That's what we're talking about. How well does that air filter, do at removing particles when it's brand new initially, right off the bat? And so this is where when you start looking at, I know micron ratings and efficiency ratings and stuff, that stuff can kind of make your eyes kind of glaze over a little bit. But this just points out the differences here between a filter that's, operating at 99, just 99%, like you see on the far right, and a filter that's at 99.999%, right? It's a significant difference in the amount of dust that's getting through that filter. So initial efficiency, super important. That's a really critical aspect of the air filter that you choose to run in your system. And again, that efficiency will generally increase as that filter goes through the course of its life, but that right off the bat, that's really important. So as we think through that process, if I'm just changing my air filter every 6 months, or I'm changing it every 3 months, or whatever amount of time it is, I really don't know how much life is left in that filter. I could be changing that filter too often, and which if I'm changing it too often, think about what we just talked about here. Every time I put a new air filter in, I'm letting more debris through, letting more particles through during that initial stage of the air filter's life. So that's one downside. In the instance that we're just changing it every 6 months, and maybe I, for whatever reason, have been operating in a little bit dustier environment than usual, I could be changing that air filter too late, and I could actually be causing some harm on the other end of that spectrum, where that engine's having to work harder and harder and harder to get the same amount of air because maybe that air filter actually has become restricted more than it should be. So, we kind of get into this guessing game if we're just changing it based on a set amount of time. Now, we mentioned as that air filter continues to get more and more contaminant loaded, it will reach that moment of terminal restriction. And that's kind of like we are just describing here, where that engine's having to work harder and harder and harder because it's not getting the same amount of air through the air filter that it was when that filter was working the way it should have been, maybe kind of right at its peak performance. It's kind of, a good analogy would be going out and, running a marathon. Maybe you're in great shape. You go run a marathon. You can breathe, breathe through your nose, breathe through your mouth. You're getting all the oxygen you need. Well, go and try and run that same marathon and breathe through a straw. You're going to be quite exhausted and not getting the amount of oxygen you need in your body. And that's kind of what we're doing to the engine if we're waiting too late to change that air filter. So after we replace that filter, that restriction level is going to drop back down. It's going to kind of be back to that initial phase. And then, we kind of start that whole process over again. So I guess point number two here is that we're making is air filter service life is really not set on a predetermined amount of time either. That's not really a good way to decide when to change the air filter as well. So that kind of brings us to our question. If we're not changing air filters based on visual inspection, and we're not changing air filters based on a set amount of time, when should we be changing our air filters? When is the appropriate time? And if you said restriction gauge, that's the correct answer. We need to be monitoring it through the use of a air restriction gauge. Now, many of you guys that have been around the industry a long time, whether it's over the road or off highway, you're very familiar with the little gadget you see on the screen here, this air restriction gauge, this manual restriction gauge. Now, if you have been around a long time, you're probably looking at the screen going, yeah, those really aren't the most reliable readout. And many people don't really take a lot of stock in what those gauges even say, if they can even read them or if they're even functioning properly, or maybe they've been broken off or damaged and people don't pay attention to them. That's been my experience as well. That's what I've that's the voice I've heard from a lot of customers, talking with people in the field, talking with technicians. This has sort of been the industry standard for a long time. And certainly it is better than the alternatives that we described, but it does have some limitations. But at the end of the day, we want to be monitoring air filter life to really make a good determination of when we should be changing it. I'm excited to show you a product that we have. If you guys have not seen this before, we have been talking about it for a while, but if you haven't seen this before, this is a new solution from Fleetguard that we've got in the marketplace today that we think is a much better alternative for helping you guys, helping your customers to determine when to actually change that air filter. And it is part of our Fleetguard Fit, which that stands for Filtration Intelligence Technology. It's part of our Fleetguard Fit product portfolio, and it can be used as a part of our broader telematics package. But the cool thing about this part is you can actually use it as a standalone solution. And so what this does is it's designed to thread right in that same port that those old school filter minder gauges, those spring-loaded gauges, would go into in that air intake system. It's designed to go right in that same place, but it is a digital readout. So it's digitally connected, so it's got a power wire and a ground wire. And the kind of party trick you see there from the light is it actually has an LED light inside of it that will change color based on the remaining service life of the air filter. So as that air filter continues to plug and restrict through the course of its life, it will monitor that, and using some algorithms, it has to meet certain thresholds and levels of restriction that are sustained over a certain amount of time before it will actually trigger and trip and go to the next color. So it's giving you a much more accurate readout. And the nice thing is, instead of having to measure and look at little lines and see where that little spring-loaded contraption is, it's just a bright light color that tells you exactly what's going on with the air filter. So it makes it a quick, easy visual inspection. You just have to, pop the hood, take a look there, or, for some instances where maybe it's an off-highway piece of equipment where that air box is kind of sitting out and exposed, and that filter minder gauge would be out and exposed. You just look behind you in the cab, and you can see that bright light shining there, and it's going to tell you exactly what's going on with that air filter in real time. This is just an example. This is one of our test trucks, demo trucks we have down at our Cookeville facility here in Tennessee. But you can see this is broad daylight. You've got the hood popped up. You can see exactly what that color looks like under the hood. And again, it's just giving you an idea. It's a great all-make solution for customers. You could put this on everything from a lawnmower to, a piece of high horsepower equipment and everything in between. Just makes it really simple and easy for the technician or the person that's maintaining the the application to know, hey, when should I be changing this filter? Just a quick, easy visual look. So you can see here the different colors as it moves through, and some of those advantages over that manual restriction gauge. One of those being, uh, think about those manual restriction gauges. One of the things that I always heard about those is, maybe for those moments, kind of that momentary restriction where maybe we're accelerating our vehicle down the on ramp, getting on the interstate, trying to get up to speed, and that momentary restriction can actually cause those to kind of trigger and pop, and they're just a little less accurate in terms of what's actually happening with the air filter. This is designed in a way that even in those moments of temporary restriction, it has to be sustained over a long enough period of time that it's really telling the engine, hey, something's actually happening here, and it's time to move on from green to amber, or maybe we're getting close to that terminal restriction. It's going to actually change to a red color. So pretty cool little trick here. We have 3 part numbers for this application today. So as you're thinking about maybe some all makes customers you've got in mind, or maybe you've got yourself here listening, have a lot of different pieces of equipment. These are the 3 part numbers we have today. They're going to look virtually identical. The only difference being there over on the right, that particular part number, the SK15967, does come with a barbed fitting and a grommet. So if you had an application that did not already have one of those filter minder gauges and you wanted to drill a hole and tap that in where you could put this in an instance that didn't have that port already installed, that's more for a universal solution. But they are designed for different levels of restriction. So that 25 inches of restriction that we are normally paying attention to, whether it's 25 or 21 inches, that's going to give you a little bit of an indication there at the bottom of our typical market segments of where you would use which part number. So more of your off-highway, a little bit more severe duty applications, that's the part number that you'd want to use there in that first column, SK15959, and it is set for 25 inches of restriction. And the other part numbers to the right, the universal one we mentioned, the 5967 and the 5960, those are more for your over-the-road, less severe duty applications, and it is set for 21 inches of restriction. Just to point out, if you're curious, if this is piquing your interest, if you've never seen this product before, I will mention it's a relatively inexpensive part for us. And for those that are familiar with our discount program, if you're set up on our discount program or selling to somebody that is on our discount program, this is a part that's eligible under that program. So again, it's a very cost-effective solution for really helping your customer get every last drop of life out of that air filter before they go and replace it. So really doing some goodness for good things for their business. We've got some additional resources out on the fleetguard.com website that I want to make sure you guys are aware of. So we've got an installation document here. These are a couple of snippets from that. If you wanted to look at that on the fleetguard.com website in our literature section, you can see a little bit more about how to do the install, kind of what's necessary there. If you've got anybody in your shop or you yourself are technically inclined whatsoever, this is a very easy product to install. It's not going to be some big complex thing for you to do. Probably in the course of an hour, hour and a half, you could have this thing fully installed and up and running. So maybe quicker than that if you're really handy. We've also got a YouTube video. So if you want to go out to the fleetguard.com website, you can get to our YouTube channel, or you can just go directly to YouTube and find Fleetguard out there. We have a YouTube installation video here. It's about 4 or 5 minutes, and it kind of walks you through that process as well. So if you wanted to kind of get a visual of what it takes to put this thing on your system, I would encourage you to go check that out. Yeah, so it's going to kind of talk you through it and show you in real time how to do that installation. So we're getting close to the end of our session today. I did want to talk a little bit about some best practices. So as you think about from a maintenance perspective, actually servicing your engine, servicing the air intake system with the air filters, just some things to keep in mind from a Fleetguard perspective that we would consider to be best practices. One of those being leave the air filter element in the system in place until you are actually ready to service it. This is one that I mentioned earlier where oftentimes people want to just open the system up and take the filter out and look at it and see if it's dirty, and then they put it back in. And we really don't encourage that for one primary reason, and it's that that is a system that, again, we want to minimize the risk of any sort of debris or contamination getting into the clean side. So when I say the clean side, I just mean behind the air filter, where it's actually going to go into the engine to be consumed and during that combustion process. So every time we're opening that system up and messing around in there and looking around in there, all we're really doing is creating more opportunities for debris or contaminants to go in that system. So we really do recommend that you leave that air filter in place until you know it's time to replace it. And that's part of, again, why it's so important to make sure you're using restriction gauge. And then that way, when it's time to replace the air filter. There's no guessing. You're not taking a peek in there to see what's going on. You just leave it in place until it's time to replace it, and then have your air filter ready so that you can do that service event as quickly as possible. Something else that's a good practice, just generally inspecting the entire air intake system. Look at the hoses, look at the clamps, look at the service cover, look at all the duct work and the piping and all the little connector pieces. From time to time, make that a part of your daily. If it's a piece of equipment that you're using a lot, go and inspect that, check it out from time to time. Just make sure there's nothing out of the ordinary. It's very common as these systems age that parts just see wear and tear. You might have some loose parts, or a clamp that broke off of the service cover, things like that, right? And we want to minimize risk. And so, in the event that any of these things are broken, just quickly, as quickly as you can, get those replacement parts, fix the system. We want to keep it in good working order. We're also looking for any sort of tears or rips or cuts or holes that might be on that air intake system, particularly downstream on the clean side from the air filter element, because an air system is going to always, that air is going to follow the path of least resistance. And if there's something missing, or there's a hole or a tear in that system, dirty, dusty air is going to go right through that, and it's going to bypass that air filter. And we want to prevent that from happening. So just routinely make it a part of your preventative maintenance to go around and take a look and see if there's anything out of the ordinary, and just do what you need to do to get that fixed. Something else that we recommend. So, in the situation where you have a system that has a primary and a secondary air filter element, we really recommend that you do not remove that secondary element until the housing has been cleaned. So, you can see from our YouTube video here, this is on our direct flow air filter system. I believe this is a versatile piece of kind of ag equipment, a big farm tractor. It is common for there to be like a kind of a light sheen of dust between the primary and secondary filter in one of these systems. And so what we want to do is, as we remove the service cover, we remove the primary air filter element. We want to get just a damp washcloth or paper towel, and we want to just wipe out, kind of clean out any sort of debris that may be in that air intake system before we remove that secondary. Because again, we want to prevent any sort of contamination from getting onto the clean side. So a good recommendation would just be have all your materials ready, and we want to minimize the time that system is exposed. And so we want to kind of wipe it down, get any sort of residual stuff that may be inside the air box, get that all wiped out and clean, so that when we replace that secondary, we can do that as quickly as possible without stuff getting on the clean side. So you can kind of see, sort of wipe down there. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? But just, do as best you can to kind of wipe that situation out. And then lastly, right? So, Jim, I saw your question come through, but I figured I'd just wait to get to it. We know this is a common thing out in various industries that deal with, heavy duty diesel applications. And, we're not ignorant to the fact that many people do clean their air filters. We, as Fleetguard, as a part of Atmos Filtration Technologies, we do not recommend cleaning air filters. And the reason for that is really back to what we talked about with the design of an air filter. So when you think about what is used to make an air filter, what kind of media is used? It's cellulose paper media. The question I normally ask people is, how easy is it to tear paper? I'm not Sylvester Stallone, I'm not Arnold Schwarzenegger, but it's pretty easy to tear paper. And having watched plenty of videos of how people do tend to clean their air filters using compressed air hoses, things like that, you are again creating risk that doesn't need to be there. You are not minimizing risk by cleaning your air filter. I'll say it that way. If you're using a compressed air hose, you're blowing that system out. Maybe you're even using water to clean it out. You're really creating an opportunity to damage that media. And again, think about what we just said a second ago. That system, that air is going to follow the path of least resistance. If we take that compressed air hose out and we start blowing the air filter out, all we have to do is create a pinhole in that air filter media, and now we've created a dust bypass where that dust is going to go directly through that hole. And it may not even be a hole that we can even see with our own eye, right? I mean, it can be a very, very fine, very small tear in that media. And now we've created an opportunity to dust bypass. So that's one of the reasons. The other one you see there on the left, unfortunately, some people do take the air filter out and beat it on the ground or beat it on the side of the tire. Um, Again, there's an opportunity there to damage the filter, and we don't want to damage the filter because then that filter is not going to do its job. It's not going to protect the engine the way it's supposed to. So, as you kind of asked the question there, does Fleetguard endorse cleaning air filters and why? I hope, Jim, that kind of talks you through our thought process of why we don't recommend it, because there is an opportunity to actually damage the product, and then the product can't do its job. And so that is why we do not recommend it, why we do not endorse cleaning air filters. And as far as I know, the other reputable air filter companies, thinking of Donaldson as well, I've read plenty of their documents where they do not endorse that behavior as well. So that is something you want to keep in mind. If we get a warranty claim filed and it's been very apparent to us when we get that filter back that it's been cleaned, we're not going to warrant that situation. And so, that's something you really want to pay attention to. And just, it's really about risk. We would prefer you replace the air filter. That's our recommendation. Replace the air filter with a new one. And then that way, it's going to perform the way it's supposed to. We're not, there's no risk of, having that product damaged and then it causing a dust bypass. Which kind of gets me to the end here of our presentation, talking about our warranty. Fleetguard does have a non-prorated warranty. So in the event you were using one of our products, or maybe using one of our air filters, and in that unlikely scenario where the filter has not been cleaned, but our filter did leak some dust, have a dust bypass, and maybe cause some engine damage, you can have that peace of mind, stand assured that we do provide a non-prorated warranty. And that simply means that we are going to review that situation. And if it's our fault, our product caused that engine damage, we will actually provide the funds back to the customer to repair that engine back to working condition. Or in the event that we, damaged the engine, or, catastrophic engine damage, we dusted the engine, we are going to provide that full value back to get the customer a brand new engine. And that is something that is pretty different than some of the other filter companies that we compete with out in the marketplace today. Many of those companies will prorate. So they're going to write a check for the value of that engine with the mileage or hours that were on it at the time of failure. We don't prorate that process. So you get that full value back. So that is something that, using our products, it is a differentiator, and you get that premium experience in the event that something does go wrong. So just want to make sure people are aware of that. You can read more about our warranty out on the fleetguard.com website, but that should be some peace of mind in using our products. So I'm going to take a quick pause here. I know there were quite a few questions that came through. I'm going to take a second to review those. If you have additional questions right now, this is your time. So please throw those in the chat window here, in that Q&A window. I'll do my best to answer them. I don't have all the answers all the time. So if there's something I don't know, I'll certainly follow up. So Jim, I guess kind of part two of your question, do air filters have an expiration date for replacement? Given, our applications rarely get clogged, sounds like, for maybe power generation applications, that's a great question. In terms of product in service, I probably could go ask some folks about that question. I know our general shelf life policy, so not necessarily product that's actually on application, but just products sitting around on a shelf per se. Typically, that number is 3 years is our shelf life policy. But as far as a product that's actually out and working in the field, yeah, I don't imagine many of those power gen applications are, you know, because they're not maybe not even necessarily being running all the time, but when they are running, may not necessarily be in the highest dust environment. So let me ask around, Jim. I can get an answer for you on what's typical for replacing those things as they're actually out in service. But I can definitely follow up on that for you. Yeah, I see the question here or kind of comment maybe more. I'm surprised that air filters are not a mandatory replacement at PM services since dirty air filter could cause so many issues. And in my experience, again, just a lot of times when I walk into a dealership or I'm going in somewhere where people, technicians are working, I like to just ask the question, "Hey, how do you guys know when to change air filters?" And generally, it is part of a PM, and they're changing them, like I said, on a set amount of time at 6 months. And I always encourage those folks to think about what they're spending. Ultimately, I guess it's up to the customer, but you know very likely people are changing their air filters way too often. I'll just say that there's very likely over servicing air filters. And I mean, I work for Fleetguard. We're in the business of selling filters, so inherently it's not the worst thing in the world for us, but ultimately the customer is spending more money and actually kind of exposing their system to more contamination if they're servicing too frequently. So that's, again, to me, a great sell for that LED restriction gauge, because you'll get every last drop of life out of that filter before you really know you need to replace it. So that's something to think about, for you guys. But I would be surprised if people were not changing filters too often in those just over the road truck environments. Yeah, Jason, your question here on recommendations for how frequently you should be servicing the secondary. Um, is it the same time as the primary or every other time? Um, it's probably dependent on the exact product. Um, I think from what I've seen, with our some of our products over the years, you might be replacing that secondary element, every other time or every third time, something like that. So, it generally is seeing less dust than that primary. So that's where that primary may be getting serviced more often. But if you've got specifics there, I could probably get you patched through to somebody from our application engineering team to give you exact answer for your situation. But generally it's less often than the primary, if that helps. Melinda, yeah, can the fit air restriction gauge reminder be wired into the dash? So essentially, the way that system is designed to work, it's kind of a standalone. It's got a ground wire and a power wire. So effectively, you can kind of wire that in however you would like to wire it in. I don't know, as far as if you've got lights on the dash that tell you when you need to replace certain components, depending on the application. There may be an option there. If people are curious, more curious with questions about exactly how to wire that in, I would just encourage you, please email me. You should have my email from this webinar. Please email me and I can get you connected to our fit team directly. And, they've done lots of installations on these, so for anybody here on the call, we can, certainly get you connected if you need to talk through specifics there. But yeah, basically that power wire, you can wire that in, effectively however you'd like to for your particular application. Yes, the question, could the fit indicator, I guess it doesn't matter on the part number, but you've got SK15959. Can you install that on a passenger vehicle? Absolutely. Yeah, I know we've got some employees that have, like I said, they've put them on everything from lawnmowers to passenger cars and, kind of everything in between, just kind of playing with them. Yeah, it really is up to you on where you'd like to install that. Again, it's just going to be set for that level of restriction. So if it's 25 inches or if you want it at 21, it's going to read that out on whatever application you have. So yeah, if you want to put that on a pickup truck or passenger car you've got it sitting in your driveway, yeah, go for it. There's nothing holding you back there. Jason, this is another good question. Will the LED light help indicate the condition of the secondary filter, or is it only analyzing the primary filter? That's a good question. I guess it depends on, if you've got that filter minder gauge, it's going to be, I guess it's wherever that's kind of plumbed in or where that port is on the air housing. So, if that port for that filter minder gauge is, if it's, behind the primary or behind the secondary, that'll be your dead giveaway for which, kind of what it's measuring across the system. But let me follow up on that one for you, Jason. I can probably get you a more specific answer there. See the question here on the take on cleaning or blowing out air filters. Hopefully, we covered that in enough detail. It is very common, guys. I mean, we do know it happens. Air filters are not cheap, and that's certainly why folks do it. But really, it is all about risk at the end of the day. Do you want to minimize risk? Do you want to take a chance on doing that, possibly causing damage? Maybe you've never had an incident with it, but that really is something that, if you did damage it, you did have an engine problem. Fleetguard's not gonna, they're not gonna, cover that warranty. So that's just something you want to be careful with, because most of those the companies like us that make air filters, that's going to be probably their stance on it as well. Cicada invasion. Oh man, yeah, you're on the ball here. So the cicadas are coming. Will the intake system catch them before they get to the air filter? I suppose there's a chance, I suppose there's a chance that they could make it all the way and get captured by the air filter element in the system. I guess it just really depends on what your setup looks like, right? But yeah, they are coming this summer, so we'll be curious to kind of see what happens with that. It's been a while since we've had them here in Tennessee. Question here about humidity affecting the performance. That's a good question, because the way the system's designed to work, it is measuring inches of restriction. It's inches of water restriction. So I suspect there is some effect on the performance of that restriction level. Uh, but I'm not. I'll be honest. I'm not. I'm probably not that technically minded to have a great answer for you there, sir. So let me follow up on that one. I've got all of your names here. This is being recorded, so I can follow back up with you guys via email. Let me see what kind of answer I can find out there for you regarding humidity. Are you in a? I guess you're in a area that has a lot of. Maybe you're close to the coast. I know somebody else mentioned that in one of their questions they were kind of close to the coast, kind of a coastal area, so maybe higher humidity levels. I can get an answer for you on that for sure. Yeah, Jim. Okay, I'm just getting down here now. I know full well air filters have been in place for over a decade. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to replace them if they've been in there for over a decade. But I'll try to get an answer on that one for you as well if we have a recommendation on life of service in the field for sure. Art saying I typically recommend every 2 years for air filters in the power generation environment, assuming there's no other indication to change. Would be interested in learning what Fleetguard's recommendation is. So, Art, I will follow up with you guys. It sounds like you and Jim have some similar questions here, and we can definitely get you an answer from our group. And Jason, back to yours. Should you be using two LEDs if it's got a primary and secondary? It's not. My experience is that that's not the case. I don't think you need to be using multiple LEDs. The only time where that could be an issue is, if we're talking about maybe some big high horsepower piece of equipment where it's got, multiple air filters, right? So think about a haul truck that might have, four of those great big air filters or six of those great big air filters. That's where you could possibly be using multiple LED sensors. But I will, like I said, I'll follow up on that question for you to get a better understanding on the kind of the primary secondary situation. Well, guys, we are right at time. I do want to be respectful of the time here. I appreciate the comments, the questions. If you don't have my email, it is j.stevenson@atmos.com. Please feel free to email me. You should have my email, though, from the webinar and getting signed up. But certainly want to take the time to thank you here. If you've got a second, you should, like I said, you should get a survey. You can also use your QR, use the phone, use your camera phone to fill out our survey. We'd love to get your feedback on the session and possible future topics. So please encourage you to do that. Let us know what you think. And if there's any way we can help you there, we'd love to be a resource and support for you. But otherwise, guys, I want to thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And we will be back somewhere around this time next month to cover our next topic. So thank you so much. Hope you guys have a great Thursday and great weekend ahead.